Alright guys, welcome back to the channel, it's Matty T here, and these are all of the new bass decks that have come out with Mythical Island. First and foremost, we're going to be taking a look at a fan favorite, or the opposite of a fan favorite, I guess, maybe is whatever Mewtwo EX is. So Mewtwo EX has gotten a lot better. I know this is sort of an older deck, a deck that was probably the most played deck in the previous format of Genetic Apex. However, now we have other cards to add to it, things like Mew EX, which helps cover its matchups against things like Charizard. In fact, Mew EX has completely taken Charizard out of the format, but Mew EX still can be good in some niche scenarios. This deck list is only running one copy of Mew EX. You could just run two copies and then run the Budding Expeditioner package to get Mewtwo out of the active spot, or Mew out of the active spot. But for the most part, this deck has just gotten a lot better because of Mythical Slab, which is this new item card basically that allows you to look at the top card of your deck, and if it's any Psychic type Pokemon, whether that's a Basic, a Stage 1, a Stage 2, any Pokemon in your deck, as long as it's Psychic, then you can put it into your hand. And if not, you put it on the bottom of your deck. It's another card in our deck to help add some consistency, draw more cards, and find our evolution Pokemon particularly more easily. Now, the one thing I would recommend with this deck is to play your Pokeballs before you play your Mythical Slabs, mainly because we want to pull those evolution Pokemon with Mythical Slab. It's kind of, the only way in the game to draw an extra card that is an evolution Pokemon, basically. And it is super strong. It gives the deck that much more consistency. Again, Mew EX, we throw in the deck in case we do go up against things like Charizard, because that is, again, one of the main decks that really counters Mewtwo EX. However, there is a new deck that is, a great counter to this particular Mewtwo list, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, Mewtwo EX, one of the most consistent decks in the game right now, one of the strongest decks. Overall, I think that we're probably going to see this deck stay the most played deck. It's just really good in so many different matchups, but overall, I think that it got a lot better with the inclusion of Mew EX and Mythical Slab. I think that it does struggle a little bit in a couple key matchups that are pretty popular right now in the format, kind of anti-meta picks. And yeah, but I would say that Mewtwo EX is definitely at the top still of the Pokemon TCG Pocket meta. All right, now we also have to talk about Celby EX, and the verdict is out about what sort of the best way to play Celby EX is. A lot of people, of course, want to run Superior for that jungle totem effect here. That's going to double the coin flips that we get with Celby EX. It also allows us to attack for just one energy, which can be pretty good in scenarios where we can do potentially 50 to 100 damage. Can be really strong. However, I think the best card to be playing with Celby EX is Exeggutor. That's what we see in this deck list. This is the version of Celby that has been doing the best in the online tournaments, and that's because it's kind of the best of both worlds. We have the Jungle Totem Superior package with Celby, so we can kind of do that infinite damage and Revenge KO, kind of set up and sweep with Celby. But we also have Exeggutor. We have both the new single prize Exeggutor, which again works really well with Superior. For only 2 energies attached to it, we can do 80 damage plus 30 more for each energy attached to our opponent's Pokemon. 30 or 20, I forget. But either way, a stage 1 single prize Pokemon that can be really, really powerful. And then we're running Exeggutor EX, which again is just a really strong card right now. It puts us at a range of things like Pidgeot, or the new Gyarados card, or Mewtwo EX. So, Exeggutor is really, really good. I just think that Celby, it doesn't necessarily know what to do. There are Celby decks. I made a video talking about kind of what the best versions of Celby EX were, and I think that some Celby EX don't run Superior, but I think if you're playing in an online tournament and you're trying to win that tournament, you want to play the deck that has the highest potential, right, the highest ceiling, and that is, of course, playing it with Superior, even though you do sacrifice a little bit of consistency, sort of relying on a Stage 2 Pokemon to do a lot of damage. The real downside with Celby is, since it's a setup deck, we don't necessarily have a really consistent frontline Pokemon that can maybe take a KO while we're building up Celby. That's really what Exeggutor EX is able to do. But again, if you're running 2 copies of Celby and then you're running 2 Exeggutor EXs with Execute, and then you're also running the 6 cards that make up the Snivy, Servine, and Superior line, your deck is very Pokemon heavy. And again, if you don't draw into that Superior, this deck is kind of a sitting duck in a lot of different scenarios. There's also quite a few Pokemon right now that are above that 150 HP threshold, which requires you to flip 4 heads on Celby, which can be pretty tough unless, again, we're talking the super late game. But we do get access to Erika's to kind of heal up. Erika's goes really good with Exeggutor EX, but can be really good with Celby as well. The scenarios where we kind of just starting with Celby in the active spot, and we're just kind of just putting energies on Celby turn after turn. Erika's can keep Celby alive for much longer. By turn 3 or 4, if you're still alive, I mean, the likelihood of you KOing whatever is in the active spot is pretty high. So I do think Celby is a good deck, but I don't actually put it right now in the top 1 or top 2 slots. That might change as things go on, but right now, I would say that Celby is probably still a top 5 deck, but I would not put it as, maybe the best deck in the format right now. That deck, in my opinion, is coming up, and we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, Celby EX, people love it, people hate it, but it's not a bad deck, and it deserves to be mentioned. Okay, next up is the deck that I think will end up being the strongest deck in this new Mythical Island format, and that is Gyarados EX. This is kind of the most widely accepted or played version of Gyarados EX, which incorporates the Greninja line to do extra chip damage with Water Shuriken, and Druddigon to sit into the active spot, which also does chip damage, but kind of tanks hits in the active spot for a lot, which allows us to kind of wait a little bit, kind of stall a little bit while we get our Gyarados EX set up. This card is so good. Gyarados is incredible. Druddigon's good too, but Gyarados is just, it's really like an anti-meta card in terms that, the best cards in the format just can't one-hit KO it. It counters Mew EX because, of course, Gyarados doesn't one-hit KO itself. It has 180 HP for a stage 1 Pokemon. It has an attack for 4 energies, but again, 4 energies isn't that hard to attain, especially with 2 copies of Misty's in our deck, and the ability to stall with Druddigon. It does 140, but we have 180 HP, so Mew EX isn't one-hit KOing us back. Things like Mewtwo EX aren't one-hit KOing us. Even Pikachu, Celby is very difficult to one-hit KO us. Gyarados is just so strong. It's the best setup sweeper right now in the game, I think, and 140 damage can be a little bit awkward. Things like Executor have 160 HP, Mewtwo EX is 150, but again, with Druddigon, with Greninja to kind of fill the gaps there of that damage output, it basically allows us to do all of that extra chip damage through Greninja and Druddigon while only having to commit energies to Gyarados EX, which we can kind of swap in and then just start sweeping our opponent. I think that Gyarados is actually, like I said, the best deck in the game right now. It isn't something that a lot of people imagine, but again, it has all of the advantages that Articuno had before, except now we basically have the ability to one-hit KO a lot of Pokemon where Articuno struggles with. Yes, Articuno is a basic Pokemon, so you have the potential to, on your first turn, flip 3 heads on Misties, and that is really strong, but I mean, you can't do that with Gyarados, but by turn 2, you can effectively one-shot anything in the game if you get lucky enough, which is just crazy. So it still has that crazy, like, aggro tempo potential, but it's also one of the most effective sort of setup late-game sweeper decks, available, basically. It has a really great matchup into Mewtwo, good matchup into Celebi, good matchup into other Misty decks that aren't Gyarados. It's good against Scolipede. In fact, it absolutely kind of walls Scolipede. It's good against Weezing decks. It's good against basically everything in the format right now, and yeah, I don't really see anything kind of taking Gyarados out of that top spot. In fact, I think that it's maybe a little bit less consistent overall as things like Mewtwo EX, but it's just so strong. I don't even know what else to say about Gyarados. It's a sleeper pick. People did not expect Gyarados, at least I didn't expect Gyarados to be the best deck in this new format, but I really do think it is. I think as time goes on, as people kind of collect these cards and people kind of move off of things like Celebi and kind of reallocate into playing Gyarados EX, we're going to see it just absolutely dominate. So I think at the top of the format, we're going to see Mewtwo EX with Mew in the new Mythical Slab. But other than that, we're going to see Gyarados. And I think those two decks are going to compete at the top of the metagame right now. Pikachu can be strong, of course, because it is consistent and you can 2-hit KO Gyarados. So there is that potential. However, Druddigon fills that void in that matchup extremely well because Pikachu does not 1-hit KO Druddigon. So that makes that matchup so much better. I think that if we're playing Pikachu EX right now, we're kind of basically needing to play Giovanni, or else this Gyarados matchup isn't even that good for you. So where do I want to put Gyarados on the ladder of the best decks? We'll have to see as time goes on, but it is going to be a top 3 deck, and it very well could be the #1 deck in Mythical Island. It is just, it's crazy. Gyarados EX is here. All right, next I actually want to take a look at the best Fire-type deck in the format right now. Something that not a lot of people expected, but again, Mew EX, the introduction of Mew EX in Mythical Island and in this format made Charizard basically unplayable. For a card that was a Stage 3 Pokemon or a Stage 2 Pokemon that needed 4 energies, Mew EX being a basic Pokemon that can one-hit KO it back for only 3 energies made Charizard just really unviable and not worth playing. Charizard still had a good matchup into Mewtwo EX, however, Mewtwo EX is also playing Celebi, and a lot of decks are playing Celebi right now, or not Celebi, rather, Mew. A lot of decks are playing Mew, so it's not really worth playing Charizard in general. So Arcanine kind of was that #1 option, and it turns out Mew EX actually fits really well in the archetype of Arcanine, the Arcanine archetype. So yeah, we're still running the, the 2 copies of Growlithe and Arcanine. We're running the 2 Moltres to get that thing set up. And basically this allows us to, once we start Inferno dancing, we can kind of accelerate those energies to Arcanine while manually attaching to Mew EX, kind of that backline secondary attacking option, which is going to be really good again in Mewtwo and in some other archetypes and in some other matchups that Arcanine struggles with. But the upside with Arcanine is it does have a really good matchup into Pikachu and into Celebi. So pretty interesting as well. I think that Mew helps cover the Mewtwo matchup, but I don't know if Arcanine will end up, or any fire type deck in general will end up being the best deck in the format, because like I said, I don't think Celby is going to, you know, rise to prominence. I think Celby is going to fall off as time goes on, and Arcanine is a little bit more of a counter meta pick to Celby, but pretty decent across the board. If you do like fire type decks, I think this is the deck for you. The one upside for this is that we're not running too many Pokemon, so the deck flows a little bit more consistently. We're not running too many basic Pokemon, so the opportunity for us to start with Moltres in the active spot is pretty high still, and we have a little extra room in the deck to run things like Giovanni and run Sabrina. The 120 plus the Giovanni 10 is 130. That's enough to KO Mew EXs in return as well. So it's a strong deck, and I think that it actually has a contender to win tournaments. I think that if you're gonna play fire, this is probably the best option for you. The problem is, and I'm gonna say this about a lot of decks that we're gonna cover here, is that Gyarados exists, and this deck just cannot do anything against Gyarados, and most decks can't do really much against Gyarados either. So yeah, we're gonna see that Gyarados deck is kind of the big wall of the format right now, and it's gonna be kind of the gatekeeper for a lot of these deck lists. But Gyarados aside, this Arcanine deck is quite strong, so I would recommend it if you want to play a fire type deck. All right, and this is going to be the new best dark type deck, but also the new best non-EX deck, and that is the new Scolipede card. Weezing got a big buff with the release of Leaf as a supporter card. We had Koga before. Weezing was always good before, it just didn't necessarily have a great partner Pokemon to pair with it. Now we can play things like Mew EX or Tauros or Scolipede, or even yeah, I mean, or Pidgeot, I guess. You could play Weezing with Pidgeot as well. But I think most people kind of settled on the fact that Scolipede is a really great partner with Weezing, of course, being able to benefit off of the poison gas leak ability that Weezing has, and then we can do 120 damage for only 2 energies on Scolipede, which is really strong. The upside with Scolipede in this deck is that it has 140 HP, so we're kind of safe from getting 1-hit KO'd in a lot of scenarios. Aside from Gyarados, this deck gets absolutely walled by Gyarados again, but it's very, very strong. We also have Tauros as a backup attacker, and like I said, with Koga and Leaf, we basically have twice as many options to pivot Weezing out of the active spot to go into our attacking Pokemon, and the math just works out really well in this deck list. The poison from Weezing, again, buffs the attack on Scolipede, so we do 120 damage, but we don't have to attack with Weezing to poison our opponent's active Pokemon, so we can kind of poison, you know, retreat out, go into our Scolipede. Now we're hitting for 120, plus the poison damage is 130, and that is enough to KO a lot of decks in the format right now. This deck is exclusively comprised of non-EX Pokemon, which means our opponent has to take 3 KOs, which can be exceptionally annoying in a lot of matchups for our opponents, especially since we have Koga to pick up our Weezing and fully heal it. So this deck list has a lot going for it, and I think it's really good across the entire format, other than Gyarados. It's really good against Celby, and it's good against Mewtwo specifically. It absolutely kind of counters these Mewtwo decks really powerfully. Scolipede is protected from Mew EX. Mew EX can copy Scolipede's attack, but it's only going to do 70 unless our opponent has a way to also poison our active Scolipede Pokemon. So really good into Mewtwo EX. It's going to do a lot of different matchups. In fact, I thought this deck was going to emerge as one of the best decks in the format until Gyarados kind of rose to popularity and kind of walled a lot of decks, and Scolipede and Weezing kind of included in all of that. But yeah, if you wanted to play sort of a budget deck or a single prize archetype, I think that Scolipede is your #1 option right now. But I think that the Weezing package in general is really strong, and we're going to see a lot of decks that incorporate Weezing. I made a video that that was a deck basically focused on Weezing with Mew EX and Tauros, and it was really, really strong. I think that Mew EX might be the best partner for Weezing still, just because, you know, we have a little bit more flexibility in how we run that deck, but also you can play Budding Expeditioner with Mew EX along with Koga and just pick up your active Pokemon over and over again. If you haven't checked out that video, rather, you should go check it out. It's really fun. It's a really cool deck. But yeah, in general, Scolipede, it's a good list, walled by Gyarados, but actually has a pretty decent matchup spread across the format. I think this deck has the potential to sit comfortably in the 3 or 4 most played deck spot and most strongest deck spot, below probably Gyarados and Mewtwo. It's, again, going to kind of remain as an anti-meta pick, but the matchup spread is good enough. The deck is strong enough to where it can kind of just sit within the top 5 as a totally viable deck list. Okay, now I also wanted to include a Pidgeot EX deck. It's pretty fun. Again, we're also running this Druddigon package with Tauros, and this helps us kind of figure out the math a little bit with Pidgeot. Similarly to Gyarados, we want Druddigon to kind of sit in the active spot, chip away at our opponent while kind of buying us time to set up our Pidgeot, and again, kind of sweep through our opponent's deck. We have Pokemon Flute to put a basic Pokemon from their discard pile under their bench, which further buffs the damage from Scattering Cyclone. Does 80 damage plus 20 more for each Pokemon on our opponent's bench. The problem with Pidgeot in this particular deck list is we're running a very similar list to that Gyarados deck. However, we're kind of just a worse deck in every way. Pidgeot EX, and I'm not trying to make anybody upset by saying that, but Pidgeot EX has less HP, oftentimes does less damage for a stage 2 Pokemon, where Gyarados is a stage 1 Pokemon. Yes, it only takes 3 energies, but we don't play Misty in this deck. We play Misty and Gyarados. So overall, this deck is kind of very similar. It fills a very similar niche to what Gyarados fulfills. However, we're also weak to Electric. So practically a very, very similar deck to Gyarados, except Gyarados, I think, is just better in every way. I wanted to include it because it is a new deck. It incorporates a lot of new cards. The Pokemon Flute combo can be really fun, but in general, I just don't really expect Pidgeot to emerge as a top deck in the format, unless something else comes out that really pairs synergy-wise really well. I know you can run Weezing with Pidgeot, and I have seen a Psychic-type Pidgeot deck, which is really interesting. I might make a video on soon, but in general, I just don't think Pidgeot is as good as Gyarados and fills a very similar niche, just doesn't fill it as well. So I don't think Pidgeot's going to emerge as a top deck in the format, but it is one of the new best decks, so I wanted to include it. All right, now quickly, I just want to take a look at this deck list, which does incorporate the new Lumineon. This is Starmie with Lumineon. These cards actually go together really well. I wouldn't say that this is one of the strongest decks in the format right now, but it is a new archetype, a new deck, and it is really fun to play. Starmie, 2 energies, does 90 damage on a stage 1 Pokemon, but it has a free retreat, which is really, really good. We don't have to play Leaf or X-Speed in our deck. And Lumineon is a stage 1 Pokemon for 2 energies, does Aqualiner, does 50 damage to one of your opponent's bench. Now 50 plus 90 is 140. That is enough to take KOs on most Pokemon in the game. So the flexibility that this deck has and the ability to not rely on a lot of different energies, we can kind of basically spread out our energies really effectively, get all 2 Starmies and 2 Lumineons set up pretty early on, and because we have free retreat, we can kind of shuffle in and out of all of our Pokemon and take some pretty cheeky KOs, Pokeflute as well, to put a basic Pokemon on our bench and maybe KO it as well with Lumineon. Pretty cheeky deck. We can play 2 Sabrinas, we can play 2 Misties, we even have room for a red card in the deck. The only thing with this is that Lumineon has 80 HP and Starmie EX only has 130, so both Pokemon are in range of getting KO'd by a lot of different Pokemon, and for that reason, I just don't think it's really going to emerge as a top deck in the format. As far as water-type decks go, Gyarados exists, so again, I just don't think Starmie Lumineon is going to be a top deck in the format, but if you haven't played this deck, it's actually really fun, and I would recommend it to anybody trying to have, you know, some interesting games on the ladder and play a deck that's a little bit outside of the metagame, but something that is still pretty viable and strong, and you certainly can win games with it. All right, the other deck that I wanted to include just quickly is a deck with Aerodactyl, a fighting type deck. Fighting type decks, again, didn't get a whole lot of support in Mythical Island. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of great cards in the fighting type card pool. Now, we do have the Mankey and Primeape sort of package here, which is a really fun aggro deck list that saw some success in last format. It's not going to be anything top tier in that sense, but now we can actually pair it with Mewtwo EX to kind of do a lot better in some of those matchups that Primeape struggled with beforehand. But in terms of an aggro deck, this is kind of your best option. I know the new Marshadow card did come out. We do have Marowak, so some people might have opinions on what the best fighting type deck is, but when I looked over all of the recent online tournaments, at least in these first few days of Mythical Island, this was the only fighting type deck that I saw that ever got somewhat high on, you know, the standings for any of these tournaments, and I was a little bit surprised by that as well. Aerodactyl is in the list. I don't know necessarily what Aerodactyl does. It's kind of just a decent bench sitting Pokemon. We get a little bit disruptive ability there with Primeval Law. It can potentially come in clutch here. We do run 2 Sabrinas, so we can bring a basic Pokemon into the active spot and stop it from evolving. That can be really strong, especially with, again, the fast-paced nature of Mankey and Primeape. And then we do have 1 copy of Mewtwo EX if we need to sort of revenge KO. So the deck has enough going for it where, again, you can win games, but again, I just don't think any of these cards are like top tier cards. And I just don't think fighting type, maybe next set, maybe in January when the second full expansion comes out, fighting type will rise to prominence. But for now, fighting type is a little bit lower on the ladder for sure. But I thought this deck was somewhat interesting, so I wanted to include it. And yeah, let me know what you think. All right, and lastly, I just wanted to include something that I thought was really kind of interesting. It's another non-EX sort of budget deck archetype, and this is just Greninja with Druddigon, but instead of like Gyarados or Pidgeot, we're just running 2 copies of Tauros. Tauros is a really strong card, does 120 damage to EX Pokemon for 3 energies. It's also a basic, so this deck is really consistent. And things like Greninja's Water Shuriken and the Rough Skin ability from Druddigon can kind of, fill the gaps from a damage perspective that Tauros otherwise, wouldn't be able to do. But the upside with this deck list and why I actually think it's somewhat viable is because there's no EX Pokemon. So our opponent has to KO 3 Pokemon to win the game, basically, against this deck list. And we're running Fire Energies and Water Energies in this particular deck list, so we can attack with Druddigon, we can attack with Greninja. So all of the Pokemon in this deck have the ability to attack, unlike the Gyarados deck where we're running exclusively Water-type energy. So that is an upside for this particular deck list. So I wanted to include it because, again, I thought it was interesting. I thought it had potential, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be better than, Gyarados or even Pidgeot for that matter. We'll have to see. But if you wanted something that was a little bit easier to build, if you don't maybe have Gyarados or Pidgeot, if you haven't opened all of those EX cards, if you're a free-to-play player, maybe this is a great deck for you. This and Scolipede, I think, are the best single-price archetypes right now, aside from Blaine's, of course. But yeah, I wanted to include it because, again, it actually did pretty well in a couple recent online tournaments, and I thought it was a little bit different, so I wanted to include it. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I've been Matty T. This has been all of the new best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Comment below, what do you think? What deck are you playing? What decks do you think will emerge as the strongest decks to play in this new format? We have about a month until the next set comes out, and until then, the metagame is going to evolve and shape a lot. So I'm really interested to see kind of what decks rise to prominence. Like I said, I think Gyarados is going up, Mewtwo EX will stay up, and Celby, Pikachu, other decks like that maybe will fall down and make room for some other decks to kind of come up and counterplay. But yeah, again, let me know what you guys think down below. The support has been incredible, by the way, the last few weeks of me uploading Pokemon TCG Pocket videos, so I really appreciate it. And if you guys could like the video and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me, and it would really help out the channel a lot. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you guys next time, and have a good one.